Hi, everybody. This is David, and welcome to the Week 5 Fireside Chat for Educational Leadership, 655 Pupil Services, and Non-Discrimination with Viterbo University. This week begins Monday, February 21st, and concludes on Sunday, February 27th, 2022. Let's begin with a recap. Your learning team assignment is due Sunday, February 27th. Be comprehensive, but also create something that is realistic and would be user-friendly in your school. Terrific discussions this week about the TORUS. And there are two ways to interpret the TORUS, or the bagel, or that sense of similarity. So the first way is that we need to ensure that we are providing authentic experiences for students. And that gets to be both a little bit complicated and a little bit exciting right now. Think about the metaverse. So what does it mean when we have the opportunity to do virtual field trips, or to maybe transition students from, okay, we're going to talk about taking a hike out at the school forest, and then we're going to have this new step that's in the middle where we're going to use our headsets and our haptic wearables and things like that, and we are going to kind of do the pseudo experience of it in more of like a metaverse type setting. And then from there, we'll transition further. So I think there's some real opportunity there, but the key is going to be very aware of authentic experiences and that we don't swap out virtual experiences for authentic experiences. The virtual experiences will be an awesome bridge to get us into those opportunities for authentic experiences. So that's the first part, authentic experiences. The second part of the TORUS is to recognize when you are on the edge of your familiar zone or your comfort zone. And that's something, especially students with anxiety, and we see more anxiety being diagnosed in student populations. That was well before the pandemic. It's increasing now. Maybe it'll be part of long COVID. Who knows? So we'll see that through 504s, maybe through OHI. But helping students to recognize when they are getting out of their comfort zone, when they're getting to that crust of the bagel, and not to fear that, right? To say, here's where I'm at. This is unfamiliar. So, okay, where do I go from here? What is life like when we have something? Maybe it could be a field trip, it could be an assignment, something they're not used to, a safety drill, whatever it is, new teacher, right? Things that transition them out of their familiar zone. So it's, how do you recognize when you're getting to the crust of that bagel? And when you're there, then how do you start to navigate outside of the crust of the bagel? The Centers for Disease Control, School Connectedness, and YRBS are good resources. The CDC School Connectedness webpage is awesome. But be careful not to overweight the YRBS. So the YRBS findings, we know that there are flaws with surveys, especially when they're given to youth. I wrote about that extensively in School of Airs. So be aware of that. Also, once you aggregate survey information, it quickly dilutes. And it changes from the unit of measure. So if the unit of measure is your high school, or if it's your sophomore class, and suddenly it gets brought in with 12 other schools, and then there's some data, here's what this profile looks like of schools in the county or a multi-county area, that's much different. And typically that can significantly skew from what that unit of measure is, which might be your school or a grade level or a class or whatever it is. So just to be, again, aware of that. The YRBS, I know the state will say, submit YRBS data for grants and things like this. But the YRBS is not a mental health diagnosis tool. It doesn't have the constructs to do that. It's more of a broad measurement of kind of trends. So week 4 shout outs. Joe Ellen, dun, dun, dun. You reflected on the question of using NARCAN in schools. So students that might overdose on opioids, or anybody, right? NARCAN is designed to be a nasal, inhaled through the nose or injected through the nose, and then to counter those effects. And you wrote, I never thought we would need defibrillators in all buildings. Nevertheless, thinking about now NARCAN. I did a presentation 3 years ago for the Wisconsin Library Association, so many librarians. And at that time, I was surprised at how many libraries in Wisconsin were both training library staff on the use of NARCAN and providing NARCAN. And it wasn't solely big areas. Some of these were very small rural libraries. As a Pupil Services Director, likely your responsibility in overseeing alcohol, tobacco, drug abuse, and addiction programs and services and making those connections. This is going to come up. And I would say we're not far away from this even possibly being a state bill, such as, the EpiPen was a few years ago. So, you want to be aware of this and kind of figure out where you'd inform yourself on this. Say the Board of Education asked you, they said, Pupil Services Director, we read this article in the Eau Claire newspaper. What are you seeing in schools? And how are you being informed by counselors? And when you go to county meetings and what, the school nurses are saying. And ultimately, do you think we should have NARCAN in schools? It probably wouldn't come down to being that streamlined, but yeah, this would require a Board of Education policy and training and application of how to apply the NARCAN, where it's going to be stored, things like that. But I think we're closer to that. So it's one of these things where, as Joellen wrote, when I was starting out in administration, defibrillators weren't in schools. And when I left, every school had one. And also every building had numerous EpiPens. So Leah wrote about the TORUS and cleverly framed it as two NFL teams competing in the Super Bowl, but they had only played Madden football to prepare for the event. So that would be something to see. So the authentic experiences extend beyond the physical environment. So we think of the TORUS and getting out into the physical environment, but it's also that you have genuine experiences, right? So you have an opportunity to order something online, right? You understand what that is. You understand what shipping is. You can order a pizza online. I mean, these types of things. Authentic experiences of using, money to buy things. So yeah, the authentic experiences. I remember a school district that I worked with and had a jar of artificial change, right? I mean, it was like plastic pennies and nickels and stuff like this. So the whole thing was maybe like $1 or $2 worth of change. And at some point I was like, well, why don't you just use change, right? And because it's $1 or $2, it's much different than handling a plastic penny. Kay wrote about the TORUS and considered 504 plans developed for students with anxiety and thinking how what is taught in the school transfers into the community. The plans included self-advocacy, and at the same time, the act of advocating might manifest the anxiety. So it's a great point, Kay. So you're saying part of the plan for the student is to exercise self-advocacy. But as a student starts to consider that, right, the self-advocacy itself brings upon anxiety. So you have to break it down into this task of really working on the self-advocacy first and how to initiate, and then generalizing that into multiple environments. And that's something too where we talk about maybe that goes from practice in school to a practice in a metaverse type thing, and then practice into an authentic community. But that's a really good point of there's all of these sub skills to work on first before you come out into this authentic environment. Tiffany shared a terrific piece of advice that was shared with her by a mentor when she started teaching. And that is, all I want you to do is to get to know your kids, your students. We can deal with the paperwork later, but I want you to get to know your students. That is great advice. She felt that mindset was key for putting in place restorative practices to center on that healthy relationship with the child. And I believe that's wise advice. The paperwork side of pupil service is an octopus. I mean, there's so much that goes into that. But, right, that's how working with your neighboring districts, we talked about that, working with your CESA, getting some templates together, sharing some forms across your districts. How do you maintain these files? One district I worked with had a Google Drive where they had different headings for restorative practices, activities that staff had come up with and students had come up with. And as students and staff would develop new ones, they would, work with the principal and decide to put them in these different Google Drive categories. So they suddenly had a fully populated drive, right, that had a restorative practice for bullying, or a restorative practice for vandalism, and maybe, at a 6th grade level or at an 8th grade level. And, so it was fascinating because staff had ownership in it. Students had developed some of these restorative plans also. But that was something then that got shared across several districts. In MOODLE, child trafficking. This is something that happens in all 72 counties in Wisconsin on an annual basis. Adults and children. It's documented, it's reported. We don't hear a lot about this in schools, and maybe we don't hear enough about it. So we're going to talk about that this week. English language learners, migrants, homeless students. For English language learners, identify your resources and connect with districts that have been through changing populations. Obvious things such as language accessible website and documents are places to start, but then working with your CESA and again, districts who have gone through similar changes in population to say, well, what would you recommend to me? What are some things if you could go back to make this transition better for your English language learners? What would you do? Presidential administrations will convey their positions on migrants. So review Lodi's policy for ICE agents and coalesce your own guidance. The guidance that you might give to your Board of Education on staff protocol and discretion if ICE agents were on campus. It's better to have these discussions now. One superintendent shared with me that in 2018, a staff member told him that if agents showed up on campus, that staff member was going to drive migrant students without, knowing their citizen status, but was going to drive these migrant students away from the school in their own vehicle. And they felt that this was in line with the school district's beliefs, and this was going to be their protocol. But certainly, right, there was a big gap in inter-rater reliability. This is what one staff member is thinking. What is another staff member? What might be the position of a school? So as you go in and read the document, the Lodi policy, it's also good to make sure that, your staff aren't going to engage in activities which are not aligned, right, with the law. So have those discussions now. Again, it was something more prevalent maybe 4 years ago than it is now, but those types of things can change the interpretation of the use of ICE agents depending upon presidential administrations, which you'll probably go through a number of administrations in your career. Homeless students have become lost during remote learning. So what's professional development that's being provided to staff? How are you identifying if a student is homeless or it's remote learning, so they're logging in from somewhere, but right, they still technically could be homeless. So this is a question you can also bring to your CESA. CESA 6 has a very strong ELL department, and also asking your CESA, what are our district obligations to meet the 1987 McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act? Transportation is sometimes confusing, and it's also a cost that is difficult to anticipate and budget for. So work with your business manager. I wrote that it's kind of a Nike. You just do it when it comes to transporting homeless students. The Prioritization Matrix, I have it in this week's class. It's another quick tool. It's kind of like a SWOT. It can help you prioritize areas that are generally subjective. I use that a lot during my career. So once you look at it, you could use it for a lot of different things, right? To get a ranking of, is this more important than this, and what are our top 2 priorities? So again, things like a SWOT, things like a prioritization matrix will help you immensely. The reflective teaching annotation. When conducting your 5-year Pupil Services Nondiscrimination report as required by the DPI, you have much allowance in how you craft that report. Balance it with the numbers and the interviews, so the quantitative and the qualitative. The Alexandria, Virginia Student Services Program template that I posted shares fresh ideas on how to craft that, so you get a lot of quotations in there. So there's a lot of context for the numbers. It's similar to the way that the DPI 5-year report is put together. School social workers and county social workers operate from different knowledge bases. Preserve flexibility in the schedule of your school social workers so they can be nimble and respond to things versus on this day in the morning you have to be here, and this day in the afternoon you have to be here. And I've seen schools do that. And once you start to get very locked down in a schedule, or you start assigning a school social worker to bus duty and to recess duty and things like that, it really diminishes that person's ability to be responsive to very acute situations with which they are typically asked to respond to. Special education has been the service basin for students who might more appropriately be served by ELL programs. But none of those programs exist in the district. So if you have more ELL students, or a range of ELL students, different languages, different cultures coming into your district, but your programs aren't matching that, it's often that the default for services, especially for English, end up being student is referred to Title I or into special education, specific learning disability, or so forth. So to be aware of that and to make sure that you have fidelity in special education, ELL, Title I programs. From the syllabus, visit CESA 6's ELL webpage. Also, I have a link on there to the Wisconsin Public Television Kindness Curriculum. It can be downloaded at no cost, and it has SEL Standards. So right there is an instant boost if you don't have anything like that. Again, the link is in the syllabus under week 5. Have one learning team member submit your allergy project. Please ensure that all team members' names are on the assignment, and please limit the use of color, because I do print those out, I grade them by hand, and then I return them. So my printer back there thanks you, or back there, for not using a lot of ink. And again, make that very practical, right? So if you, again, this whole plan for Bruce, that this, if you're explaining this to staff, or you're explaining this is how we do things to a school board, like they would get it, right? Don't make it hyper technical and attach all these policies and things like that. And think of what we've talked about in this class. Like, how are you visual? Are there any visuals, any diagrams that might be included, or a picture of an EpiPen? So someone's like, oh, that's what the EpiPen looks like. Or are you going to include a picture of Bruce? I mean, how are you going to do that? So there are a lot of ways to approach this assignment. So that's a fascinating part. This is very divergent, how you're going to put this together. And don't forget too, part of this assignment is how you help to educate staff and students about allergy awareness. So, some books for your library that have to do with allergy awareness would be appropriate for that. Thanks everybody, and keep posting.